began like a whisper before dawn, then turned into a roar that made the ground tremble. In the pale morning haze over eastern Poland, villagers near Podlaski froze as the sky erupted with thunder. Dozens of F-16 fighter jets sliced through the clouds in tight formation, their afterburners blazing against the dim horizon. To those on the ground, it looked like the beginning of a war. To Moscow, it was something far more dangerous, a message written in jet trails. The next phase was already in motion, and Moscow had no idea how deep it would go. The official story was simple enough: a NATO air readiness drill meant to strengthen deterrence and defense along the eastern flank. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing, Western intelligence circles whispered another version. According to sources cited by Defence News and BBC Monitoring, the operation had been planned in near secrecy under a classified directive issued in early October. The order circulated among NATO air commands outlined a rapid eastward relocation of F-16 squadrons from bases in Germany and Italy to the Polish frontier. The destination, the very edge of NATO territory, only minutes from Belarusian and Russian airspace. In military terms, it was called a forward deployment rehearsal. In geopolitical language, it was a stress test designed to measure Moscow's reflexes, its radar efficiency, and its chain of command under sudden pressure. The logic was blunt: if Russia could be rattled by a few dozen fighters, how would it react under the real weight of a coalition response? Weeks before villagers in eastern Poland heard the first sonic boom, satellites had already begun tracking unusual activity. Reuters reported convoys of fuel trucks and radar systems moving east along Polish highways, while temporary hangars appeared overnight near the Suwałki corridor. Maintenance crews, radar operators and logistics units were quietly flown in aboard US C-130s. NATO reconnaissance aircraft orbited high above the Baltic Sea, mapping radar coverage across Belarus and Kaliningrad. Then in early dawn, the order went live. At precisely 05:45 local time, F-16s launched from multiple bases across Poland in synchronized waves. Locals in Białystok, Sokółka and Augustów awoke to deafening thunder as the jets cut through the valley fog, their engines screaming across the low horizon. Witnesses later told local Polish media that the sky looked alive. But this was no air show. Each squadron flew pre-programmed ingress routes that simulated attack vectors toward key Belarusian transit corridors, a chillingly realistic rehearsal for how NATO might respond if Russian armor ever pushed westward through the Suwałki Gap. Inside Russian command bunkers, the reaction bordered on panic. Air defense radars from Grodno to Kaliningrad pinged continuously, trying to track the erratic formations. The jets' flight patterns were deliberately unpredictable, diving and climbing in coordinated maneuvers to saturate enemy radar coverage. It was psychological warfare through precision, flying a silent message. You can't see all of us, but we see you. Within an hour, the Western Military District raised its alert level. MiG-31 interceptors scrambled from Baranovichi, and Belarusian early warning radars began transmitting emergency data to Moscow. In the Kremlin's underground command center, generals watched in real time as over 40 radar contacts blinked on and off, too fast and too varied to trace accurately. For them, it was déjà vu, a scene straight from Cold War brinkmanship, only this time the tension was real, the stakes immeasurably higher. By sunrise, the Kremlin's press office was already in motion. The Ministry of Defense denounced the flights as provocative, accusing NATO of trying to destabilize the region. Yet behind closed doors, Russian analysts admitted what few dared to say publicly: they'd been caught completely off guard. The West had not only rehearsed a potential air campaign, it had done so right under Moscow's nose. And as dawn broke over Poland, one question echoed across Europe's defense ministries. Was this the beginning of a new phase in NATO's confrontation with Russia, a phase no longer confined to words but to the roar of engines? As the sun climbed over Moscow, the first briefings reached the Kremlin. The situation was chaotic. Radar data from Belarus, Kaliningrad and Western Russia painted a confusing picture of dozens of NATO aircraft maneuvering dangerously close to Russian airspace. Reports from the Western Military District confirmed that several formations had flown within striking distance of key installations, oil depots, communication centers, and missile batteries. The pattern analysts warned resembled a combat simulation, not a routine drill. According to early reports from Reuters and DW, the low-flying squadrons were less than 30 kilometers from the Belarusian border. The air shook with the sound of synchronized engines as radar screens across Europe lit up with dozens of fast-moving signatures. At first it appeared to be a training exercise, but satellite imagery soon revealed otherwise. These were not routine patrols. Multiple squadrons of US and Polish F-16s had taken temporary forward positions near the Suwałki Gap, the narrow stretch of land connecting Poland and Lithuania, NATO's most vulnerable corridor and Russia's biggest nightmare. By 8 o'clock that morning, the Russian Ministry of Defense raised the alert level for all air defense units from St. Petersburg to Smolensk. Crews rushed to their stations, S-400 missile batteries were activated, and long-range radars began sweeping the skies for any sign of escalation. The order was clear: monitor, but do not engage unless provoked. Yet the tension in the control rooms was electric. Inside Moscow's fortified command centers, rows of officers watched massive screens showing real-time feeds from radar networks and satellite imagery. The defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, was seen conferring directly with the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov. According to Reuters, both men had been summoned to the Kremlin for an emergency briefing with President Vladimir Putin. Intelligence reports suggested that several of the aircraft bore US Air Force tail markings, confirming that the United States had quietly redeployed squadrons from Germany and Italy. That revelation changed everything. What began as a Polish exercise was now unmistakably a NATO-wide maneuver. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. It told Moscow that the alliance could move assets from Western Europe to the Russian border in hours, not days, and that no part of Russia's western flank was beyond reach. State media quickly went into overdrive. RT and Sputnik began broadcasting dramatic footage of F-16s, streaking through the Polish skies, declaring that the West was preparing for open confrontation. Television hosts spoke of NATO's creeping aggression, while commentators warned of provocations meant to test Russia's patience. Yet in private, even seasoned analysts admitted the truth: Russia had been surprised by the operation's speed, coordination and scale. Within hours, the Kremlin's countermeasures unfolded. Military transport convoys moved toward the Belarusian border, carrying radar systems and missile launchers. At Baranovichi Air Base, interceptors were armed and placed on standby. Over the Baltic Sea, two Tu-22 M3 bombers resumed long-range patrols, flying uncomfortably close to NATO airspace near Estonia, a calculated signal that Russia still had its claws. Meanwhile, on the ground in Belarus, the reaction was fierce. The Lukashenko regime accused NATO of violating red lines and announced that it would deploy additional missile units to its western border. Belarusian state television showed footage of mobile launchers and Iskander missile systems moving under camouflage nets. For civilians living near the border, the atmosphere shifted overnight. In small towns from Grodno to Brest, residents reported heavy military traffic, low-flying jets, and constant rumbling from convoys moving under cover of darkness. Local media described it as the loudest week since the Cold War. In diplomatic circles, the mood was no less tense. European capitals lit up with urgent communications. Warsaw called for an emergency security session with NATO headquarters in Brussels, while Lithuania and Latvia placed their own air defense systems on heightened readiness. By nightfall, the message was clear: the skies over Eastern Europe were no longer calm. The thin line between training and confrontation had nearly vanished. And inside the Kremlin, one haunting question echoed through the marble corridors. If NATO could move this fast during peace, what could it do in war? By the second day, the sound of jet engines over eastern Poland had become a rhythm of defiance, a constant reminder that the balance of power in Europe was shifting in real time. Every takeoff, every sonic boom carried a message deeper than military might. It was psychological warfare at 20,000 feet. Inside the Kremlin, the news hit like a cold wave. Within minutes, Russia's Ministry of Defense ordered full alert across its western military district. The question racing through every briefing room was the same. Was this a drill or the prelude to something far greater? According to Deutsche Welle and BBC defense correspondents, the operation, now publicly identified as Operation Eagle Shield, was designed not just to test NATO's speed, but to send layered signals to multiple audiences. To Russia, your western flank is under watch and your advantage is fading. To Belarus, your alliance with Moscow is being measured every hour. And to NATO's own members, the alliance is united, active and operationally ready. What startled Russian observers most wasn't the noise, it was the organization. The F-16 squadrons weren't operating from established hubs like Lask or Krasicini anymore. They had rotated forward to newly modernized airfields such as Minsk Mazowiecki and Malbork, facilities upgraded in recent years precisely for rapid wartime deployment. Convoys of fuel trucks and ammunition carriers poured in under the cover of darkness. Mobile command posts were established, encrypted communications came online, and electronic warfare units began testing jamming protocols. From above, NATO surveillance drones captured the choreography with precision convoys moving under camouflage nets, radar dishes aligning, and maintenance crews working through the night under floodlights. The entire eastern corridor of Poland looked less like a drill zone and more like a forward operating theatre. Moscow's intelligence analysts could no longer pretend this was routine. As one retired Russian general told Izvestia, they are practicing the first 72 hours of a real war. His words sent shockwaves through military forums and defense think tanks. But the real power of the operation lay not in its hardware, but in its timing and symbolism. After years of Russian dominance in hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, and covert influence, NATO had found a different form of deterrence visibility. It was deterrence made loud. Every F-16 streaking across the sky was a statement that NATO no longer needed subtlety to show resolve. In Warsaw, Prime Minister Donald Tusk framed the operation as purely defensive, emphasizing Poland's right to readiness amid growing Russian military activity near the Belarus border. But in Moscow, the mood was anything but calm. Russian media began warning viewers about NATO's encirclement, portraying the flights as a dress rehearsal for invasion. By contrast, Western analysts saw something more intricate, a strategic balancing act. NATO had pulled off a massive mobilization without firing a shot, all while staying within international law. The alliance had demonstrated capability without triggering escalation, yet the risk was undeniable. As former US Air Force officer Colonel Mark Reynolds told Defense News, "The closer you fly to the threshold, the harder it is to tell where the exercise ends and deterrence begins." That threshold, the invisible line between preparation and provocation, was now razor thin. Every radar ping, every maneuver, every coded transmission could be mistaken for aggression. The longer the operation continued, the more it risked becoming a spark. In military doctrine, such moments are called pressure windows, brief, dangerous intervals when neither side can afford to blink, and right now the window was wide open. As dusk fell on the second day, NATO's jets still roared over the forests of Podlaski, their vapor trails glowing orange against the setting sun. To the people below, it looked beautiful and terrifying. To Moscow, it was a clear warning the West was no longer watching passively. It was moving, and it was watching them. To understand the scale of this alarm, one must understand the machine itself. The F-16 Fighting Falcon, first introduced in the late 1970s, is one of the most battle-tested aircraft in history. Agile, lethal, and adaptable, it can dogfight strike ground targets and suppress enemy air defenses all in a single mission. More than 4,600 have been built, serving in over 25 nations. But beyond its capabilities, the F-16 carries symbolism. When it appears near a hostile frontier, it does not whisper diplomacy, it announces readiness. By the third day, Moscow's patience had evaporated. In the heart of the Kremlin, an emergency meeting of the Russian Security Council was convened under the direct authority of President Vladimir Putin. The agenda was stark and urgent: assess NATO's provocation, determine Russia's options, and decide whether this exercise warranted a military response. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stood before the council, his briefing precise and tense. Satellite images showed dozens of NATO F-16s rotating across airfields in eastern Poland, supported by mobile radar and refueling units. Electronic intercepts confirmed encrypted NATO communications and coordinated air patterns extending toward Belarus. Intelligence agencies concluded that US aircraft were fully integrated into the operation, operating under Polish command structures. This is no longer a regional drill, Shoigu reportedly warned. It is a demonstration of invasion readiness. According to Reuters and TASS, Putin listened in silence before delivering a chilling response. Russia, he said, will not be intimidated. He ordered snap inspections of S-400 and Pantsir-S air defense systems across the Western Military District and authorized renewed strategic bomber patrols over the Baltic Sea. Within hours, Tu-22M3 bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads were seen flying dangerously close to NATO airspace near Estonia. The message was unmistakable: Moscow would respond on its own terms. Meanwhile, across Belarus, Russia's closest ally preparations intensified. President Alexander Lukashenko announced the deployment of additional Iskander missile units and combat-ready Su-30SM fighters to the border zone. Columns of armoured vehicles moved through Grodno under cover of night, their engines echoing across empty highways. Local residents described the convoys as endless, stretching for miles. For NATO observers, this was the scenario they had feared most, an escalation spiral in which deterrence turns into confrontation through momentum alone. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, officials debated how far to push without crossing the line. Some urged continued visibility, arguing that pulling back would signal weakness. Others warned that Russia, cornered and humiliated, might lash out unpredictably. In Washington, analysts from the Atlantic Council compared the standoff to the most volatile moments of the Cold War. The difference they noted was speed. Digital intelligence and precision weapons had reduced reaction time from hours to minutes. One radar lock or miscalculated flight path could ignite a crisis before diplomacy could even respond. As if to prove the point, a radar incident reportedly occurred over northern Poland late that night. A Russian interceptor momentarily locked onto a NATO jet before disengaging. Though no missiles were fired, the event triggered an emergency communication channel between Warsaw and Moscow, a rare direct line used only in critical situations. Both sides downplayed the incident publicly, but privately, it underscored how fragile the situation had become. Meanwhile, Russian state television framed the NATO operation as evidence of Western aggression. Programs ran footage of F-16s, and commentators spoke of existential threats to Russian sovereignty. The tone was defiant but nervous. Behind the propaganda, even seasoned Kremlin insiders could sense that the situation was slipping beyond control. By nightfall, both sides had their forces on full alert. The skies over Poland, Belarus and Kaliningrad were saturated with radar sweeps, drone patrols and electronic countermeasures. It was a chess game played at supersonic speed where a single wrong move could redraw the map of Europe. For Poland, this deployment was years in the making. The country had spent the last decade upgrading its fleet with advanced Block 52+ variants equipped with precision-guided JDAM bombs and AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles. Together with US Air Force squadrons stationed at Lask and Krasicini air bases, they formed a quick reaction force ready to respond within minutes. And yet amid the chaos, both sides hesitated. For all the noise and fury, no one wanted to be the first to cross the line because everyone knew what would follow. By the fourth day, the world's attention was fixed on Poland's eastern frontier. Satellite feeds, news broadcasts and social media channels all carried the same images lines of F-16s, glinting in the cold autumn sunlight, their contrails slicing across the horizon. For Europe, it was a moment heavy with memory. The echoes of Cold War tension had returned, but this time they came with real-time precision and terrifying speed. According to BBC World Service and Reuters, NATO's command in Brussels maintained that Operation Eagle Shield was purely defensive. Yet the scale of coordination told another story. Within 48 hours, NATO had demonstrated it could deploy dozens of combat-ready aircraft across multiple borders, sustain them logistically, and operate as a single integrated force. In the language of deterrence that was power, not theoretical, but visible. Across Europe, capitals reacted swiftly. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia raised air defense readiness to the highest level. Germany and France quietly sent additional refueling aircraft to Poland, while British AWACS planes extended their patrols along the Baltic coastline. The European Union Council held an emergency session emphasizing solidarity with Warsaw and warning Moscow against any act of escalation. In Moscow, the tone hardened. Russian officials described the drills as a Western rehearsal for aggression, while military commentators on Rossiya 1 spoke of the need for symmetrical response. At the same time, Russian social media channels buzzed with unease. Videos showed residents of Smolensk and Pskov filming columns of tanks moving toward the border. The fear was palpable. One local blogger wrote, "The sky feels heavier than before, like something is about to happen." But behind the show of strength and rhetoric lay a more delicate truth. For all its bravado, the Kremlin was facing a dilemma it could not easily solve. Respond too weakly, and Russia would appear vulnerable. Respond too strongly, and it could ignite a confrontation that neither side was prepared to survive. Inside NATO circles, officials understood that balance perfectly. As one unnamed diplomat told Defense News, deterrence only works if the other side believes you're ready and terrified enough not to test it. The operation had achieved that balance with surgical precision. It showed unity without firing a single shot. It reminded Moscow that even its fastest systems, its radars, its interceptors, its command posts could be overwhelmed by the speed and coordination of a united alliance. For the pilots themselves, the tension was deeply personal. Flying at 600 knots, 8,000 feet above the forests of Poland, they knew that every movement was being watched by Russian radar and recorded for analysis. Their mission wasn't to fight, it was to be seen to hold the line between peace and catastrophe. Each flight, each maneuver carried the weight of that responsibility. By the end of the week, one fact was undeniable. Russia had been jolted out of complacency. NATO had shown that it could project overwhelming power on short notice, and the Kremlin had learned that its adversaries were faster, quieter, and far more united than it had assumed. The question now was no longer if confrontation could happen, but when. And in Moscow, behind closed doors, even the most loyal generals whispered the same thought. If this was just a rehearsal, what would the real thing look like? From Moscow's perspective, seeing dozens of these aircraft operating near Kaliningrad and Belarus was not a coincidence. It was a signal and a test. Western analysts told BBC News that NATO was probing how fast Russia could react to a sudden forward deployment. The answer came swiftly. Russian air defense radars began to spin up across Grodno and Kaliningrad, while MiG-31 interceptors scrambled into the morning sky. The operation over Poland's skies may have ended, but its echo still hangs heavy over Europe. For NATO, it was a success, a flawless display of speed coordination and deterrence. For Moscow, it was a warning that the strategic advantage it once held is slipping away. And for the world, it was a chilling reminder that even in 2025, the old ghosts of the Cold War are never far from returning. The message of those roaring engines was unmistakable. Power in the modern era is not measured by land taken or missiles launched, but by how fast a nation can react and how clearly it can be seen. When the F-16s thundered across the Polish frontier, they didn't just carry fuel and weapons, they carried symbolism, unity, readiness, resolve. Yet the danger remains. A single miscalculation, a radar lock, a mistaken flight path, an intercepted signal could ignite what analysts call a threshold event, a spark that could turn drills into disaster within minutes. That's why every new exercise, every patrol feels like walking a tightrope over the edge of history. The question now is simple but terrifying. Will either side step back before it's too late? Or will Europe once again find itself staring into the abyss of conflict? What do you think is NATO's show of strength, the best path to peace, or just the first step toward another confrontation no one can control? If you want to stay updated on how this standoff unfolds and what it means for the balance of power in Europe, make sure to subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay tuned for the next report. Because this story isn't over, it's only beginning. What the public didn't see was that this operation, codenamed Operation Atlantic Resolve, had been in quiet preparation for weeks. Convoys of fuel trucks had been moving east across Poland. Temporary hangars were erected near forward bases, and satellite imagery from Defense News showed US C-130 transports offloading maintenance crews and electronic warfare specialists. Officially, NATO called it an air readiness drill. Unofficially, it was something much closer to a rehearsal for deployment under wartime conditions. And so as the sun rose over the forests of eastern Poland, the scene was set. The border had transformed into a theatre of power and intimidation. Every movement, every sonic boom, every shimmering contrail told the same story: NATO was awake. But for Russia, the realization came with dread. If this was just a training exercise, what would happen when the real confrontation began?